Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Cotton. I am a field specialist in nutrition and health education for the University of Missouri Extension. And today I'm going to be talking about food preservation basics. The University of Missouri Extension is what is called a land grant institute. And so it's part of our mission to carry out research based and evidence based information and programming to all people in Missouri, not just those who might be on a university campus, but to all citizens of Missouri. And this is one really important area where we do that kind of work. Food preservation, there is a lot of misinformation out there. And so it's my duty to help provide research based information, tested recipes, and resources for you. And I will share my contact information at the end in case you have any questions about this presentation or other food preservation related questions that come up as you are on your preserving journey. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to just take some time to kind of give credit where credit is due. Much of the information shared here and the resources that were created originated with the University of Georgia. They are the leaders in the research around food preservation in terms of universities around the United States. Other states are doing a lot of work too, but Georgia is really the leader. And so I wanted to make sure I just let you know that as we move forward today. So, when it comes to food preservation, we really have three different options for preserving foods. We have freezing, dehydrating, and canning. And today is really much of an overview of these methods. And we're going to spend most of our time on canning today because this is where we often get the most questions and we have the most safety concerns. But we will touch on freezing and dehydrating as well. And I do want to say the information that I am sharing today is research based guidance and it's scientifically safe and has been tested. As long as we are following directions and procedures explicitly, we will have safe products to consume. So one of the biggest concerns when we're thinking about preserving food is making sure that we are aware that pathogens are present on our food and we are taking the proper steps to kill those pathogens so that we have a safe product to eat. So here on the screen, you can see some of the more common pathogens responsible for foodborne illness. And most of these pathogens can be killed by cooking food to a proper temperature. Signs of foodborne illness include things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, headaches, fever, and symptoms usually appear 12 to 72 hours after eating the contaminated produce. So some of the common ones are E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, and then Clostridium botulinum is really the big one we are worried about, specifically with canning, but in all forms of food preservation, we want to make sure that we do our best, do all the things that we need to do to get rid of Clostridium botulinum. Because unfortunately, this pathogen can be deadly. And so it's very serious that we take those proper steps that we're going to talk about here in a moment. It's important to also know that you cannot see, smell, or taste these pathogens. It's not like food spoilage where we can look at food and see, oh, this doesn't look good. There's mold. It doesn't smell right. No, we can't see, smell, or taste these pathogens. And so again, it goes back to taking the proper steps. And if you think about how do these pathogens come to be on our food? Well, these pathogens are found in the digestive tract of animals, including humans. And so those get in touch with the soil and with our food through composting, through manure, fertilizer, those sorts of things. And so it's best if we just assume that they're there and do what we need to get rid of them. To decrease our risk of foodborne bacterial growth, we look for ways to control what we have termed fat TOM. So this is an acronym, and we're going to go through each of the letters here. So the first F stands for food. There are certain foods that pathogens like more than others. They really like foods that have a protein source. So of course, meats are high in protein, but vegetables also have protein in them, and so those are the types of foods that pathogens really thrive on. And so it's good for us to know that, and that's going to impact how we preserve certain types of food. Then we have acidity. Most bacteria do not grow at a pH below 4.6. So, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, but pathogens don't grow so well on acidic foods or with acidic foods, and so that's important to know. Time is the first T there. Bacteria need time to grow, and they can grow exponentially in even 2 hours time. So if you think about, a family reunion or Thanksgiving or a barbecue, you might have heard people say, we really need to get these leftovers in the fridge within 2 hours time. And the reason for that is after 2 hours, the pathogens could have, or bacteria could have replicated so much that it could make us sick. So when we're thinking about like canned foods that are sitting on a shelf at room temperature for, days, months, maybe even a year, that growth can be huge and it can really make us sick. So I kind of already alluded to this next T, which is temperature. Bacteria like to live or thrive between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So about room temperature is where they really like to be. O stands for oxygen. Most microorganisms need oxygen to grow. And so by removing oxygen from their environment, we can make them more shelf stable. Home canning foods removes oxygen from the jar, but do know that Clostridium botulinum can live in an anaerobic environment or an environment that does not have oxygen. So even by taking that oxygen away, Clostridium botulinum could still survive. And so again, that's why we have to bring it up to a certain temperature when we are canning. And then finally, M is for moisture. Microorganisms do need moisture to grow. And so foods are often preserved in things like salt or sugar because those bind moisture. And then dehydration, we're taking the moisture away. So that's one way we're able to control for it. So remember Fat Tom. This is a way that we can help control those pathogens or control their environment so that we can kill them off. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to spend a lot of time on canning today. And we have a lot of great resources available to you on our website, extension.missouri.edu. You can find some really thorough, detailed guide sheets to guide you if you are getting into canning. And we're not going to get super specific today, like how to can green beans or how to can jams and jellies. I'm more going to provide sort of the overarching ideas, and then you can contact me or look on our website for more information. When it comes to canning, a date that is really important to keep in mind is that in 2009, there were some important changes to tested recipes and canning processes. So if you are using recipes or resources that predate 2009, it is time to update your cookbooks, your recipes, your information that you're using. And so if you are someone who happens to be watching who's been canning for a long time, it's just good to know that some changes were made and we do need to update our recipes. If you have, for example, a lot of people like to can salsa. If you have a salsa recipe that you've been using that predates this 2009, and you really like it, but what you could do is you can look for an updated recipe that's maybe very similar, or you could also freeze your salsa. So sometimes it's just changing that mindset or changing the way that we go about preserving that food. So canned food is only as good as the fresh product that we start with. When we're canning, we want to select a high quality, unblemished food and prepare that food by following tested directions from reputable sources. So some examples of reputable sources are the USDA, your local state extension service, the book So Easy to Preserve, or the Ball Blue Book of Canning, Freezing, and Dehydration. And I'm going to share some other reputable sources with you as we go. It's very important. I've already said this a couple of times, but just to reiterate this idea, it's really important to follow directions exactly. It's not like cooking where we can make substitutions, we can add a little of this or take away a little of that. We really need to follow the recipe exactly as it says. And then we're going to place our food in a canning or a mason type jar, not just any jar. Don't want to use that leftover mayonnaise jar or something like that. It's worth investing in actual canning jars. They're going to be able to hold up against the high temperatures that we are going to process them in. And then we use a two-piece lid system, which consists of a flat lid. You can see the picture there on the screen, the flat, and then the ring band. Now, you can find a lot of different types of lids out on the market, but the two-piece lid system is really the most foolproof and what we recommend folks to use. As far as how you process your lids before the canning process starts, follow the directions on the box that you bought the lids in. They may tell you that you need to soak the lids in hot water or boil. Just follow the recommendations on the box that you bought. So this is the two-piece lid system that we're going to use. And when we tighten that ring band, we want to think about not tightening it as hard as we possibly can. We say fingertip tight. So if I can tighten that ring band with my fingers, that's still going to leave a little space where we need air to be driven out of the jar during the heating process. And so if we tighten it as tight as we can, that air might not escape and we might not be able to achieve the outcome that we want with our canned products. During this heating process, enzymes, which are natural chemicals or proteins in our food, they can cause changes in color, flavor, and texture over time. We are stopping these or inactivating these enzymes through the heating process. And so, if you think about when you buy a banana at the store, it's maybe green or yellow. If you let it set on your counter for 2 weeks, it's going to be a much different color. It's probably going to be smaller in size. It might have those spots on it. It's going to have a different texture if you bite into it. Enzymes are responsible for those changes, and if we don't inactivate them, then our food is not going to stay high quality for the time that we need it to in our jar or even in our freezer and other methods of preserving foods as well. Okay, so as our jar cools, after we put it through the heat processing and our jar cools, a vacuum seal is formed, or at least that's what we're hoping is going to happen. And this combination of events preserves our food. So thinking about that vacuum seal, if you were around your parents or grandparents when they were canning food as you were growing up, you might have been responsible for counting the pings, counting the as the seal is made. Sometimes we can hear that little ping or pop. So that might have been one of your jobs, but there's lots of ways that we can check to see if a vacuum seal was achieved. And so when we're looking at a jar that we've processed, it should have a slight concave, like it should sink down just a little bit in the center. And that would indicate that a seal is made. If we were to press down on the center of that lid, and if it were to move up and down, we would know that a vacuum seal did not occur. So in a sealed jar, if we're pushing up and down with our finger on top of that lid, the lid should not move, okay? And then finally, we can also do a little sound test. So when you tap the lid of a jar that's vacuum sealed with like a metal spoon versus tapping a jar that did not seal, the sound is much different. So I would recommend that you kind of do a little experiment at home. If you have some jars that you just canned, and then maybe another jar you could open and listen to the different sounds as you tap it with the metal spoon. So you can hear that a vacuum seal has occurred by tapping that metal spoon. So next I'm going to show you another resource from our extension partners in Kansas. They created a video series around food preservation, and that's something that you could definitely check out if you are a visual person, and you want to see some of the different practices. They have some great videos that you can watch, and we are going to watch one of those today. And so I'm going to go ahead and forward us to the next slide here. And in a second, we're going to play this video. Here we go.
While we're running our pressure canners, now's a good time to talk about the science behind food preservation. Over here, we have set up a giant size pH scale. The pH of foods is one factor that is important in determining how foods are safely processed. Other factors that come into play include water activity, which is the measurement of how much moisture is available in the food. It also depends on the size of the food pieces. It can depend on how thick the product is. It can also depend on the size of the jar, how the food is packed into the jar, whether you use a hot pack or a raw pack. So there are many factors that play into this in order to determine the process time that each food or food product needs to have. So this is our pH scale for today. And a pH scale runs from 1 up to 14, which is way on the end. A pH of 7, which is right over here, is what we call a neutral food. When it comes to food preservation and through scientific research, it has been determined that the dividing line of these foods, the point on the scale is 4.6. Anything that is below 4.6, which will be from 1 up to that point, is what we call a high acid food. These include products like lemons, any kind of pickled product. These are plums, apples, peaches, strawberries, and tomatoes run really close to the 4.6 line. This is a jar of orange jelly. This would also be a high acid food. Over here on this side of 4.6 up to 7 are some vegetables such as peppers, green beans, carrots, meat and onions, potatoes, corn, and peas. So for high acid foods, with the science that we've learned about these different kinds of foods or food mixtures, these can be processed in a water bath canner. We only need to get the temperature up to 212 degrees, which is what a water bath canner will do. For any foods that are above 4.6, which is all of these foods, we must process them in a pressure canner, and this is our pressure canner. This gets the temperature up to 240 degrees, and this will make sure that we kill any potential botulism spores that might be in the product. Botulism is the primary bacteria that we're concerned about when it comes to canning. And these types of foods, all these vegetables and meat products, these will support the growth of botulism if they're not processed properly in a pressure canner. So by getting them up to 240 degrees, then we'll kill the botulism and we should not have any problems. To measure the pH of a food or a food mixture, we use what's called a pH meter. And this is an example of a pH meter that we would use in a laboratory setting. So this salsa is a mixture of tomatoes and peppers and onions. So our tomatoes have a pH of right around 4.6. Then we start adding peppers and onions to this, and we're making it a lower acid food because the pH number is getting higher. So that makes it more of a low acid food. So on salsa, in order to make it safe to process in a boiling water bath canner, we add either lemon juice, lime juice, or vinegar. And that will drop the number down and make it a higher acid food. So let's take the pH of our salsa mixture and we'll see what our pH meter tells us. And we basically just stick the probe into the mixture and we watch for the pH meter to stabilize, and it's telling me it is 3.96, which makes it about right here. So we have a higher acid food product now, and mainly that's because we've added the lemon juice to this particular salsa recipe. So we can safely process that in a water bath canner, and there should be no risk of any botulism occurring in that product.
All right, so that's a great resource available from the Kansas State Extension. And so in the video, Karen told us that there are two approved methods for canning foods at home. Really, there's three if we think about it, but we have the boiling water canning, and where the third one comes in, there's also something called steam canning that's a little bit newer. But when we boil water can or steam can, we are the temperature gets up to 212 degrees, and we are able to process acidic foods in these two methods. For foods that are not acidic, we would need to pressure can them because the temperature is able to surpass that of boiling water, and we're able to achieve temperatures of 240 degrees. So, since we don't have that protective measure of the acid in foods like meat or vegetables or food mixtures, we need the extra protection from that higher temperature to be able to kill off any pathogens that remain. Specifically, botulism is what we're trying to kill off in these jars. So we really want to make sure that we are choosing the correct form or correct method for canning our foods. So again, acid foods can be preserved in the boiling water or steam canner, and our low acid foods would need to be pressure canned. And all of this is again going back to that food safety. We need to be sure that we are killing off pathogens, and in order to get rid of botulism, we need to achieve that 240-degree temperature that can only be achieved in the pressure canning process. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about preparing the food to be placed in the jars so that we can get to the food processing. There are two different ways that we can pack our foods into a jar. There's a hot pack and a raw pack. The hot pack is really the preferred method of packing food into a jar. And with this, we are going to heat food up for a few minutes before we put it in the jar. And what happens here is we cook food down into more of the size that it's going to be long term, and therefore we are able to get more into the jars. And so this can be more efficient because I might be able to do fewer loads. If I have a lot of green beans to process, I may not have to do as many loads and use as many jars. So it's more efficient. We also do get a little better color retention, nutrient retention. There's less floating of foods, and that's really just a visual thing. But if you like your canned foods to look pretty, it tends to look a little nicer when we've hot packed food. And so there are definitely some pros here, but you may decide that you want to raw pack your food in certain situations. I will say that recipes usually tell you what you can do. And if a recipe tells you to hot pack, then you need to hot pack. But sometimes it will give you an option. It'll say, hot pack or raw pack, and you get to decide. And so if you decide to raw pack, you're not going to cook the food ahead of time. You're just going to be placing it in the jar as it is, after you've washed it off with running water, of course, and cut it to bite-sized pieces and all of those things, following the directions on your recipe. But there's no cooking ahead of time. And so you have to pack it in your jar, and then you'll add liquid, and so on and so forth. So hot pack or raw pack, the outcome is a little bit different. So I have an example here. On the left, we have a food item. This is venison that was hot packed versus venison that was raw packed. And so you can see that, not as much once everything was cooked through the canning process, not as much of the jar is filled when we raw pack. And so some of that meat is going to be maybe a little bit drier as it's outside of the liquid. And also, again, going back to that efficiency piece, I wasn't able to fit as much in. So there's an example there. Another important thing to remember is headspace. Headspace is the space in between the inside of the lid and the top of the food or its liquid. And this is specific, and in your tested recipe, it should tell you how much headspace that you need because it's different based on what kind of food that you are using. So you can kind of see here that for sweet spreads, generally it's about 1/4 of an inch of headspace that we would need. For fruits, tomatoes, and pickles, we need about 1/2 of an inch. And then for low acid foods, 1 to 1 1/4 inch. And headspace is important in being able to achieve that vacuum seal that we want. And so we do need to follow those guidelines. I will say too, going back to this headspace, there are some nice tools that you can buy in the food preservation aisle of the store. And one of those can help you easily be able to tell if your headspace is correct. And so that might be something worth looking at if you're interested. So now let's talk a little bit about the different processes, the different methods of canning our foods. And the first one we're going to talk about is the boiling water canner. And so with this canner, remember this is a method for canning our acidic foods. So if you were doing a boiling water canning, what we need the water to be above the jars. And so after we have, of course, filled our jars, we've gotten the correct headspace, we've put our lids on fingertip tight, we are ready to put those jars in the canner. And so we want, and so, as you're kind of getting used to this process, you'll kind of have to play with how much water you need in the canner to make sure that the water gets 1 to 2 inches above the jars. But over time, you're going to get used to that, and you'll probably even get a line in your canner that shows where the water is. And so that's helpful, but it kind of takes some trial and error at first. So when you put the jars into any canner, whether it's boiling water or a different one, you always want to lift those jars straight up and down. If you tilt the jar, what can happen is some of the contents can kind of get in between the lid and the top of the jar and can impact that vacuum seal. And so you could have done all of that work and then not get the vacuum seal that is desired. And so we want to make sure we're lifting those straight up and down. And again, you can get some tools that make it really easy. A jar lifter makes it really easy to lift that jar up and down into the water. So just keep that in mind. With our jars, we also want to make sure as we're putting them in the canner, often we have what's called a flat rack. So it's a rack that's in there. We put our jars on top, but the rack does not keep our jars in place. And so we want a full load. We want to make sure that we have enough jars that no jars can fall over or move around, because again, that's going to make it so that we don't get a vacuum seal in at least some of the jars. And so if you don't have enough jars to fill the canner, what you can do is get some extra jars and just fill them with water. You don't have to put lids on them and put those in the empty spaces. That way you don't have jars sliding around. All right. So what we want to do is we want to bring water to a full rolling boil, and we have to maintain that boil while we're processing the jars. If ever we lose the boil, we have to return to the boil and start the processing time all over. So with the boiling water canner, that boiling water is really important. So after we put all the jars in the canner, we turn up the heat, we bring the water to a boil over the jars. Once that full boil has been achieved, we can start the processing time that's required for whatever it is that we're canning. So we go through that processing time, and if you do have a longer processing time, it's always a good idea to have another pot of boiling water on your stove. That way, if as the water evaporates, if you need to add some to the canner, you're already boiling, and therefore you're not going to bring down the temperature in the canner. Because again, if you lose the boil, you have to start your time all over. And what would happen to your product it would be overcooked. It would be over processed and not very high quality. So that's something that you can do, is have that extra pot of boiling water to add to your canner if needed. Okay, so once the processing time is over, you are going to and I feel like I skipped something here, sorry. You are going to turn off the heat and bring the water in, and you're going to allow your canner to just sit there. We need to let the jars sit for 5 minutes before we remove them. So you can go ahead and take off the lid. And anytime you take the lid off of a canner, you want to think about using that lid as a shield. Okay, so you kind of turn it towards you, the lid towards you, so that steam can escape. Therefore, you're not going to burn your face or your body. Steam can be very hot, or a steam burn can be very painful. So use the lid as a shield. We can go ahead and take that off, but we don't want to remove the jars. We need those to set in the water for 5 minutes before we pull them out. And this is kind of a new addition, sort of around that 2009 time that got added. If that is new for you, make sure you're following that extra 5 minutes of leaving those cans in the jar, or the jars in the canner. And then once the 5 minutes has passed, you are able to lift those jars again straight up and down out of the canner and place them on some type of cooling rack or flat surface. The cooling rack really is best with a towel underneath And this, because when we have that elevation, we have that rack where the jars are sitting, it allows air to circulate all around the jar. And this is the best way to kind of store those. And we want to leave those jars without being touched for about 12 to 24 hours. It can be really tempting to look at the jars, to take off the ring bands, to look for that seal. But we want to give them time to set and for those seals to become permanent. And so leave those jars alone for 12 to 24 hours before you move them. And sometimes this is an issue if you are canning with a friend or a relative, and maybe you're at someone else's house. Don't take your jars with you that day. You're going to have to come back at a later time to get those. So once the 12 to 24 hours has passed, you can go back and remove those ring bands. We really suggest that you store jars without the ring band on. And and that way you can see the seal a lot better as it's sitting on the shelf. So you can remove those at those times and store them as you wish. It is always a good idea to label your jars, maybe the contents that are in there and when you can them, because we recommend that you use canned food within a year of processing it. After that time, it's not necessarily a safety issue, but more of a quality issue. And so you only want to can about the amount that you could eat within a year's time. Now, what I kind of missed here, and I didn't really miss it, we don't always have to think about it, but sometimes we do. So if your altitude where you are canning these items is above 1,000 feet, you will need to adjust your processing time. And don't worry, your recipe will likely tell you this and tell you what you need to adjust. If you're not sure what your altitude is, you can find that online. Even in the Kansas City area, there are pockets that are above 1,000 feet. And the reason this is an issue is as we go above 1,000 feet, water boils at a lower temperature. And so we just have to kind of keep this in mind and make adjustments as we go. All right, so let's go ahead and move on now to steam canning. This is, again, a method of canning for our acidic foods, our high acid foods, and it gets to 212 degrees as well. So with this type of canner, and let me just advance the slides real quick so you can see what this type of canner looks like. Okay, because some of us may be less familiar with the steam canner. It kind of looks like you flipped the water bath on, flipped it over because we have that shallow base. That's going to be where our water is. So with this method, we don't have to use as much water, and because what is heating and helping us with the processing is steam instead of water. So what we would do in our steam canner is place a couple of inches of water in the canner base. There's a perforated cover that sits over the base, and we would want to bring our water to a low boil. After that, we're going to place the jars in, again, straight up and down, not tipping our jars as we place them in there. And now we have to place the lid over the base and increase the burner temperature. We cannot take the lid off for the entirety of the processing. And so the way that we know our water is boiling is there is a vent in the base of this canner, and we are looking for a steady funnel of steam to start coming out of this vent. And we have to let this steam vent for a while. And this is called exhausting the canner. And this is really important. We need that air to escape the canner so that steam can do its job and heat can move around most efficiently in in our canner. Okay, so that column of steam is 8 to 10 inches. This allows us to know that the water is boiling. We want to maintain that for the number of minutes that we need it to escape. And then once we see that, we know our water is boiling, and so we're able to start the processing time. So we're going to allow that processing time to go, if it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, however long our recipe says. And then once that processing time is over, we are going to turn off the heat, and we can go ahead and take the lid off, again, using the lid as a shield. And we have to wait to take the jars out for 5 minutes. So we just kind of let it sit in the water for 5 more minutes, just like we did with a boiling water canner. And we are able to take those jars out after the 5 minutes has passed and store them on our drying rack. Again, leaving them for 12 to 24 hours before we do anything else with them. And then we have to, once that time has passed, check for the seals, and then we can store appropriately. All right, so there again is that steam canner. And finally, we have our pressure canner. So this is for our low acid foods. With pressure canning, we really only need to start with 2 to 3 inches of water in our canner. Sometimes people fear that this is not enough, but it is, because with pressure canning, we don't need the water to come over the top of the jars like we do when we're doing the boiling water method. So we start with our 2 to 3 inches of water, and it depends on whether we hot packed our jars or raw packed as to what temperature that water needs to be. So if I hot packed my food into the jar, I want the water in my canner to be simmering. If I raw packed my food, I just need the water to be hot. Again, I want to make sure I have that full load in the canner with so that the jars have no ability to move about during the processing time. I'm gonna I'm going to get my jars in there, make sure I have the full load, and then I can go ahead and place my lid on the canner. And what I am doing first before I start to build pressure is I'm exhausting that canner. Remember, I need to pull that air out so that the heat can do its job most efficiently. And so with the pressure canner, when we put the lid on, we are going to leave the weight off or what's called the petcock open. And this is going to allow air to be driven out of the canner, and we actually have to let this happen for 10 minutes with the pressure canner. So we're going to look for that full funnel of steam. And once we see it, we're going to set our timer for 10 minutes and we're going to exhaust that canner for the 10 minutes. After the 10 minutes passes, then we are going to put the weight on our canner. If we're using a weighted gauge, we'll put the appropriate amount of weight on. Or if we're using a dial gauge where we're able to see the numbers on the gauge to know how much pressure is building, we are going to close the vent or the petcock. We're going to close that. And by doing that, by adding the weight or by closing the petcock, now we are able to build pressure in our canner. And so we need the pressure to rise to the amount that our recipe tells us. So say we are canning at 11 pounds pressure. On the dial gauge, I am able to see exactly when the gauge gets to 11, and that's how I know I can start my processing time. With the weighted gauge, we're listening for that jiggle, right? And so for most canners, you would want to read your manual about how many jiggles you need to hear per minute, but it's usually about 2 to 3 that we're listening for. So once we hear those jiggles, we are able to start the processing time. So we're going to process our jars for as long as we are supposed to. And so we'll make sure, I think sometimes the hardest part in canning is remembering to start all of your timers and keep track of that. So we want to process our food for the appropriate amount of time. And then once that time has passed, what we're going to do is turn off the heat, but we are not taking off the lid. We're not doing anything because we have to let that pressure go back to zero. And sometimes this can take a little time, so we have to be patient. Again, with the dial gauge, we're able to see as that pressure falls, we're able to visually see it get to zero, and then we know we're able to move on to the next step. With the weighted gauge, we have to wait until we don't hear those jiggles anymore. And even then, we might go up and nudge the weight. If we start to hear some more jiggles, give it some time. And if not, we can go ahead and we know that that has gotten to zero. So once that happens, and the pressure is gone, we can go ahead and take off our lid. We are able to open the canner. Again, watch out for the steam, and we are going to be able to take those jars out. And just like before, I said, make sure that you leave those jars uninterrupted for those 12 to 24 hours. Now, it may feel like you need to have all of this information memorized, and absolutely you don't. I would encourage you to look at the guide sheets on our website for the type of canning that you're using. And also your recipes are going to give you these step-by-step processes. It's just good to have that in the back of your mind as you go into your canning steps when you're ready to process your foods. Now, as mentioned, but I will highlight it here again, we really need to make sure that we're aware of the altitude in the area that we are in and make sure we are adjusting if needed. So if we live in an area and/or are canning in an area where the altitude is above 1,000 feet above sea level, we are going to have to make adjustments. And so just keep that in mind. And again, that should be listed for you in your recipe of how you will make those adjustments. So I just want to touch a little bit on sweet spreads today. I'm not going to go into it into depth, but again, we have guide sheets available for you if you are interested in doing sweet spreads. And this is actually a really good place to start. If you're newer to canning, this can be a fun way to get started. And when we are talking about sweet spreads, there are 4 ingredients that we are going to need to achieve a quality gel. And those are fruit, sugar, pectin, and acid. And let's go into those a little bit further. So with our fruit, again, just like any type of food preservation, we want to start with a high quality product. We're not going to improve that food through the preservation process. So always start with a high quality product to end with a high quality product. If you're using frozen fruit, you can do this. You would just want to make sure that it has no sugar added. Since frozen fruit is usually fully ripened, we want to use a recipe that lists pectin as an ingredient. Fruit provides flavor and color and the partial amount of acid and pectin needed to form a gel. When making a jelly or a jam without added pectin, you want to use a ratio of about 1/4 slightly underripe fruit with 3/4 fully ripe fruit if you would like to do this without pectin. Sugar must be in the correct amount to work with pectin and acid to make a gel. Reducing the amount of sugar in a sweet spread will result in a poor gel formation and spoilage. White granulated sugar, preferably cane sugar, is recommended rather than beet sugar. Brown sugar, molasses, and sorghum can overwhelm the fruit flavor, so these aren't really suggested to be used when canning sweet spreads. Light corn syrups or mild light honey can replace part of the granulated sugar, but not all of it. So for best results, you want to find a tested recipe that specifically calls for honey or corn syrup as an ingredient. A lot of times we get asked, how can I make a lower sugar sweet spread? We wouldn't want to use artificial sweeteners in sweet spread recipes that call for granulated sugar. If you want to make a sweet spread that has less sugar, you will want to use a light pectin product and follow the directions on that package exactly. Pectin is the substance that causes a sweet spread to gel. Some fruits have enough natural pectin to form a quality gel, but other fruits will require you to add pectin, especially when you are making jellies. The highest quality pectin is found in just ripe fruit, and pectin from underripe fruit or overripe fruit will not form a gel. So the ripeness of the fruit is very important here in terms of pectin. You can buy commercial pectin, and you can see some pictures there on the screen of some different options that you have. Pectin is available in liquid and powder forms, but these two types are not interchangeable. Okay, so now let's go into dehydration. All right, this is kind of it's getting more popular again, this idea of dehydration. It's fairly easy to learn in terms of different food preservation methods and can be used year round. It's nice because no refrigeration is needed and it really takes up very little storage space. So when we dehydrate something, we're removing moisture from the food so that microorganisms can't grow. Enzymes that naturally occur in our produce can lead to continued ripening and eventually spoilage, but dehydration does slow down the enzymatic process in these foods, but it doesn't deactivate them. So that is important to know. Temperature, when we are dehydrating foods, we really want it to be between 125 to 140 degrees, and ideally we need low humidity. Humidity can really affect this process of dehydration. By increasing airflow, we are able to speed up the process of dehydrating. And there are a few different methods that we can use to achieve this. There's electric dehydrators. We can do some dehydrating in the oven. There's something called air drying and then sun drying. And so we're going to go through those quickly here. This is an electric dehydrator that has an horizontal airflow. So the fans and the motor are kind of on the sides of the unit, and the airflow in this type of dehydrator is probably the best. And it, as you can see, it can hold a lot of food. You are able to dehydrate a lot at a time. A con might be the size of the unit. It's fairly large and it is a little bit more expensive than our vertical airflow dehydrator, where the fan is located at the bottom, and the air is flowing more up and down. One potential con of the vertical airflow is that the food is dripping down onto the fan and motor. And so over time, if you're doing a lot of dehydrating, potentially you could see some issues with the motor, though I think that's fairly rare. But this type of dehydrator, the vertical airflow, tends to be a little bit smaller and a little bit less expensive than the horizontal airflow. As I mentioned, there's also the option of oven drying, so dehydrating utilizing your oven. And remember, we need that temperature of about 140 degrees, which you can sometimes achieve if you have a convection setting or a proof setting on your oven. So you would need to leave your oven slightly open, and then you could utilize a fan. You could set kind of a fan outside to increase the airflow to help speed up the process. Just know that that fan could lower the temperature of your oven. And so this method does take a lot of trial and error. Also, if you have kids or pets, you'd want to be very cautious with this method. Leaving that oven open could be a danger. So just thinking about that ahead of time and planning accordingly. So air drying, this is a great method for things like hot peppers, nuts, certain herbs and things like that. We can dry them by hanging them. We could even put like a brown paper bag around the food item, poke some holes in it. That way, as that food is drying, if things start to drop, you're able to catch it there and utilize that whole the whole food item, and you don't lose any because it falls on the floor. But that is another way that you can dehydrate. Here in the Midwest, we do not recommend sun or solar drying, and this is simply because our humidity is too much, and we won't be able to achieve the outcome that is needed. But in certain areas where humidity is not such an issue, as it is here in Missouri or the Midwest, this is a possibility. So how do you know if your product is done? With fruit, there should be no visible moisture. If you were to squeeze that dried apple or whatever fruit that you've dried, you shouldn't be able to see any type of moisture. You also, with fruit, you have a little bit more of a bend when you squeeze it. So if you bent it, it wouldn't snap. If it did, you probably over dried it a little bit. And then with vegetables, they're kind of the opposite. If you were to bend a dried vegetable, you would want it to be very brittle and crisp. With both of these, it's super important before storing the item that you completely cool those items before you store them. Because that can cause some issues in the quality over time. And if all of the moisture hasn't and if all of the moisture hasn't left the product and it hasn't completely cooled, it can lead to a moldy product during storage. Okay, so finally, our last food preservation method of the day is freezing. Freezing is a popular method of food preservation, and there are a lot of benefits to this method. So, freezing does retain a lot of flavor as well as nutritive value. The color of the food is really good as well. And with freezing, it's one of the simpler methods also. Now, if you don't have a lot of freezer space, that could be a drawback. If you had to buy a freezer, that would be, of course, expensive. But if you already have one, this can sometimes be the simplest way, the quickest way, and the most economic. So with freezing, this is allowing us to preserve the food. We're going to keep the food at a temperature where microorganisms cannot grow and replicate. And so we are utilizing the temperature as a way to keep this food safe. Again, I kind of mentioned some of the disadvantages of freezing. For some, the changes in texture can be undesirable. For other people, they prefer how fruits and vegetables taste when frozen compared to maybe canned. And so for me, I prefer most of my vegetables frozen, with the exception of green beans. I kind of like those better canned. So it kind of depends on how you like the texture of your fruits and vegetables as to which method you might choose for preservation. Again, the cost of a freezer, if you don't already have one, could be a disadvantage if this is something you are getting into. There we go. Okay, so freezing, when we think about foods that we freeze, some foods do freeze better than others. So foods that have a high water content don't always freeze the best. So, if we think about things like tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, celery, those foods contain a lot of water, and when we freeze them, and then thaw them, the texture that we're left with is often undesirable. Now, with tomatoes, you could freeze a tomato if you were going to later use that to make pasta sauce or something like that. But we wouldn't want to freeze a tomato that we are going to put on a fresh salad. That wouldn't taste very good. It wouldn't have a very good texture. So that is something to think about. When we freeze foods, that high water content might not be the best. And again, we have a great guide sheet on freezing if you have questions about which foods are better for freezing and which are not. So we've talked about with each type of food preservation, we've talked about those enzymes, those proteins in foods that cause maturity and over time lead to ripeness or decay. And so with freezing, if we are just to throw our vegetables in a bag in the freezer, those enzymes are still active. And so, therefore, the quality of our food would decline pretty quickly as it sat in the freezer. And so we can take food through a simple process to help keep that food high quality for longer and to stop that enzymatic process. And so with vegetables, the way that we do this is we can blanch vegetables. With fruits, we don't typically blanch them. We rather treat them with ascorbic acid or something, or vitamin C, something like that. So with vegetables, we can take them through a blanching process where basically we put that food in boiling water for a few minutes, and then an ice bath for a few minutes, and then we dry and package and freeze that food. So that quick boil just for a few minutes is going to halt those enzymes. It's also going to kill off some of the pathogens on the food. It's going to help us achieve a really beautiful color in that food and reserve a lot of the nutrients. So the important thing about blanching is that we make sure we're blanching for the amount of time that's suggested for that food. Because if we under blanch, so say I'm supposed to blanch my food for 3 minutes and instead I do two, I can actually speed up the enzymes if I under blanch. And so we don't want to do that. So just make sure you're following the amount of time that you need for that particular food. And it's really a fairly quick and easy process to do. And we can do a boiling water blanch or a steam blanch for most foods. Then with fruits, as I said, we typically don't blanch these. We would treat them with ascorbic acid or vitamin C, and this would help us to retain the flavor and nutrients in that food over time. When we're thinking about packaging, similar to canning, we do want to label our food, what's in our package, how much, when did we freeze it, so that we can utilize our food without, we don't forget about it in the freezer, or we don't have a mystery item of like, what was this? And also, we want to avoid large packages of food where we have to take some out, maybe some thawing occurs, and then we're refreezing it. When that happens, when food thaws and refreezes several times, we're definitely lowering the quality. That's going to go down pretty quickly. So label your food. Something else we can do to help ourselves out is once we've gone, like say a vegetable, we have broccoli here on the screen. We took broccoli through the blanching process, and instead of just throwing it all into a freezer bag in the freezer, what we would want to do is place that broccoli on a flat pan and kind of separate the different pieces out. We can set that pan in the freezer for an hour or two and allow that food to be frozen individually, then put it in the bag. That way we don't have one frozen clump. So just make sure you don't forget about your sheet pans of food in the freezer, because if we leave them too long, we can get freezer burn, things like that. So 1 to 2 hours, let them freeze, then put them in the bag. That way you don't have one big clump of broccoli or berries or whatever food that you're packaging. All right. So a couple more resources. Again, I've mentioned this several times. Our MU Extension website, there's a QR code there you can grab on your screen, or it's extension.missouri.edu. We have lots of great guide sheets that you can print for free. We also do have an online class and many local classes that you can look to see if there are hands-on classes in your area. You can find that all on our website. Another website I want to point you towards is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. This is an excellent an excellent website for tested recipes and information, guide sheets, fact sheets, all sorts of things you can find there. If you're watching this video and you'd like to share your thoughts on the presentation, feel free to complete this QR code or complete this Qualtrics survey, which you can find through the QR code. And then finally, this is my information here. If you have any questions about food preservation, whether they're things that I touched on in the presentation or other topics, please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to answer those questions. And that's it. Thank
Thank,
you.
thank you so much. I grew up with a mother who canned all summer long, and things have changed quite a bit since when my mom canned her.
Yeah, that's yes, it definitely changes. So thank you,
Okay.
Cheryl.
Thank you so much. And we'll look forward to future programs from you. Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks, Cheryl.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.